Hey everyone, Liam from Solitude here, and in this video I'll be going through the top 20 Australian albums of all time. This list is based off what I think is close to a common consensus and contains no more than one album per artist. I have a long list of honourable mentions at the end, so check that out if you think I missed something. Please feel free to comment your opinions below of any that you think should be higher, lower, taken off, or included. Number 20, Human Frailty by Hunters and Collectors. Kicking the count off with this classic that perfectly encapsulates the sound of a thriving Australian suburban pub scene in the 80s, Mark Seymour's daring lyrics of love and life events perfectly balance the thumping bass and percussion, with no better example than their biggest single off this album, Throw Your Arms Around Me. Number 19, The Living End, self-titled. The self-titled debut of one of Australia's most unique sounding bands for their time, meshing rockabilly and punk, it's harder to pull off than it sounds, and Chris Chaney and co did it to perfection. One of the album's greatest testaments of prominence was the length of time its double A-side single stayed on the charts, which included the songs Prisoner of Society and Second Solution. Number 18, Lonerism by Tame Impala. Kevin Parker's sophomore album stretched his musical talents further with this psych rock modern classic. It's arguable as to which album is Tame's best, but most superfans agree Lonerism to be Parker at his peak. The sonic sounds achieved on this album were masterful for its time and completely reshaped the alternative music scene after its release. Number 17, Born Sandy Devotional by the Triffids. Australia's best contemporary to The Cure, the Triffids struck gold with this masterful display of Australian life commentary. Songwriter Dave McComb struck a chord with his lyrical observations of his hometown of Perth and Australian life. His legacy has lived on past his death, and this album remains entrenched among Australia's most respected. Number 16, The Boatman's Call by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds.
Oh Lord. Lord, into my arms, oh Lord, into my arms.
A more stripped back and introspective album for Nick Cave and his band, this album lives deep in the hearts of many Australian alternative music fans. It is debatable as to which Nick Cave record is his best, with a lot of love out there for murder ballads, but in my opinion, what The Boatman's Call achieves is more difficult to pull off, hence its placing in this list. Number 15, Hourly Daily by UMI. Once again, another album that eloquently describes Australian suburban life to a T. UMI pull it off here in a very satisfying way. Their album released previously to this, Hi-Fi Way, also draws high praise, but it's Hourly Daily's Australian commentary that gets it over the line for me. Number 14, I'm Stranded by The Saints. One of Australia's first additions to the 70s punk scene, The Saints unleashed this raucous album with tremendous underground success. The album remains a staple from the original punk era and went on to influence many successful artists, including Kurt Cobain of Nirvana, who listed them as a favourite of his. Number 13, 16 Lover's Lane by the Go-Betweens. Through the streets of your town, every day I make my way through the streets of your town. It's hard to go past these albums that can describe Australian culture to a T, and 16 Lover's Lane is no exception. The Go-Betweens had been around the traps for a while, touring the States and the UK. In preparation for the recording of this, their 6th album, The band were just happy to be home and wrote more introspectively of their homely surroundings. The product was this Australiana work of art. Number 12, Unit by Regurgitator. Brisbane genre benders Regurgitator released this incredible record leading into the turn of the millennium. Its diverse influence and perfect summation of the technology-changing world we were living in upon its release perfectly connected with the young Gen Xers of the time, and it continues to be an underground masterpiece to this day. Number 11, Since I Left You by the Avalanches. Arguably the most groundbreaking record on this list, the Avalanches were one of the first acts to release an album entirely made of samples. Not only did they achieve this feat, they also made an incredible dance-friendly and hook-laden record, with many of the songs becoming dance floor favourites. Number 10, Odyssey Number 5 by Powderfinger. Legendary Australian alt-rockers Powderfinger struck gold with this 2000 release that was a commercial heavyweight. Singles My Happiness and These Days propelled the album to the forefront of the Australian music industry at the beginning of the new millennium, after they both reached number 1 on Triple J's Hottest 100s. Shout out to Internationalist, which is also considered to be up there. Number 9, Frog Stomp by Silverchair. It's hard to believe that this grunge masterpiece was written by a bunch of teenagers in high school, considering its immense artistry, terrific instrumental performance, and lyrical depth. Daniel Johns & Co. went on to release 4 other incredible albums, but it is still their youthful debut that lives on in legendary status, especially considering its commercial success overseas and at home. Number 8, 10 to 1 by Midnight Oil. Another band with a disputable best album. I have to go with 10 to 1 though. There is a reason why this band has played one-off shows performing the album in its entirety lately, and that's why it gets over the line past Diesel and Dust for me. One of Australia's first overtly politically charged bands who were not afraid to speak their minds on Australian social issues in a dramatic and artistically pleasing way. This record was the one that propelled them to Aussie stardom before commercial success in the late 80s. Number 7, Living in the 70s by Skyhawks. The album that launched the careers of one of the golden era bands of Australian music. They propelled other notable Oz music industry staples such as Countdown and Mushroom Records with their growing success, and Living in the 70s was the record that made the cash. It goes down to this day as an instant Aussie classic for these reasons alone, as well as the success of the single Horror Movie. Number 6, Crowded House, self-titled.
Don't dream it's overhead now, head now. When the world comes in, they come, build a wall between us.
This has to be one of the greatest debut albums of all time, and also one of the biggest hit-friendly alternative rock albums. Pretty much every single on this album still gets classic Oz rock radio attention to this day. Check out this track list: Mean to Me, World Where You Live, Now We're Getting Somewhere, Don't Dream It's Over, Something So Strong, the list goes on. Oh, and by the way, yes, they are Australian, not Kiwis. See, Wikipedia says formed in Melbourne, and we all know Wikipedia is the arbiter of all knowledge. Number 5, Whispering Jack by John Farnham. The second highest selling album of all time in Australia, only behind Bat Out of Hell, oddly enough. This record went 24 times platinum. It's hard to imagine how many times this album has been purchased by Aussies, something around 170 million copies I believe. With the undying love for the single You're the Voice and others, Aussies still can't get enough of Farnsey, with the lure of multiple return shows always brewing in the comeback king's mind. Number 4, Gossip by Paul Kelly and the Coloured Girls. Paul Kelly has released so many albums and they have all been of great quality, but it is usually believed this double LP to be his best work. It's certainly the album that first launched him into the spotlight in Australia, and arguably his greatest at describing Australian culture. Kelly's work will go down as some of the greatest in history of our country, and I wouldn't be surprised if we end up seeing him on a coin or a banknote one day. Number 3, East by Cold Chisel. After finding immense popularity and success in the thriving Oz 80s pub scene, Cold Chisel shared songwriting duties around on this, their third album. The approach brought about a more diverse sound that resonated with the Australian public and launched them to home country superstars. There may often be debates as to which is Chisel's best work, but for me it's this one that broke them into the Aussie mainstream, even though it may not include their biggest single, Kaysan. Number 2, Kick by In Excess. The party rock album of the 80s, In Excess went about creating an album full of hits and achieved it. Pretty much every song on this album could have been a chart-topping single if they needed, and around 5 or 6 of them actually were. It launched them to become international superstars and long-lasting legends of classic Oz rock radio. It's honestly hard to avoid their songs when you flip around from station to station, and Kick was the album with the most hits on it that we still hear to this day. Before I reveal the number 1, here is a list of honourable mentions that didn't quite make the 20. Number 1, Back in Black by AC/DC. A tribute to their late lead singer Bon Scott, who passed not long before this album was written and recorded. It's not often that a band can lose their lead singer and live on, let alone record what many regard to be the greatest Australian album of all time. It has gone 12 times platinum in Oz and 25 times in the US. Its singles are long-lasting and live on to this day. The album made AC/DC so big that they have become timeless symbols of rock and roll, and that now pretty much every person in Western culture knows them. It's just a great rock album.